be ruined because of Brexit. Well, Brexit's here. Can you show me how it's been ruined? That's the beef. The absolute maximum of their sales that are being used by EU people is 18%. So 82% is going to non-EU end users. I'm going to start with some basics about trade, because it does surprise me how many times these things get overlooked. The first thing is, of course, countries don't trade, companies trade. And it is very important that we remember that, because often we're looking at statistics from a country point of view, but we skip over the fact that that is actually the makeup of a whole lot of individual companies' trades. And all governments can really do is either make that easier or make it more difficult. It's also worth noting that traded goods are exactly like all other goods, and they are very much influenced by supply and demand and price, availability, consumer preference, all of the things that influence our purchases on a daily basis. And that also gets forgotten when a lot of people look at top-down trade statistics. The consumer preference is very important, and we rarely find that the distance actually makes any difference. And this is becoming more and more obvious as the UK's trade is becoming more service-oriented. And we now trade more in services than we do in goods. And therefore, distance is becoming less of an issue, whereas language, legal systems, accounting systems, and consumer taste is much more important to what we trade than how close someone is. Also, the way we measure trade is very dodgy at the best. There's a big difference between value and volume. You also will find lots of ways of trying to deflate the data. I prefer to actually use real volume when it's available, because a lot of our big trade is actually done by weight or by volume. And so we have the actual figures. So we don't have to even look at chain volume measurements or something like that. We can actually say how many barrels of oil we sold or how many tons of wheat we bought. And the last thing is that being a member of the EU wasn't actually so great for UK trade. You know, Ricardo predicted this 200 years ago, that if you have a completely trading environment, trade will move to the most efficient producer. And that was not always the UK. And you can see this in UK steel statistics, which are at the moment quite popular in the press. But when we arrived, we were producing about 27,000 tons of steel each year, and Italy was producing about 17. Now, Italy is producing 22,000 and the UK is producing 6. I've got to assume that in a perfect trading environment, Italy is a more efficient producer than the UK. And we're going to see that as we go through. But my final point is trade with the EU was never free. It's just that instead of a company that was trading, paying for their goods going to the EU, it was every taxpayer in the UK was paying for those goods to go to the EU. So a large multinational like Rolls-Royce, who sold plane engines, as we will see later, all around the world, when they sold them to the US, they paid their costs. And when they sold them to France, we paid their cost. And quite frankly, that was a bizarre sort of trade distortion. But let's go on with some trade. So this is the disaster of Brexit that you keep hearing about. This is exports and imports. This is chain volume measurements, because I have been accused of not accounting for inflation. And you can see that there is a big collapse, which does coincide with Brexit, but it also coincides with COVID. And I will contest that our trade, especially our exports, was a lot more influenced by COVID than it was by Brexit, because of the sort of things we trade and where we sell it to. And you can now see that it's pretty boring, our trade. It's back to where it was. Nothing too much is happening. Imports are a bit higher than exports, but this is more interesting. If we divide it up into our exports and just look at that a bit more clearly, the red line is exports of services, and the blue line is exports of goods. And you can see that we had a massive spike in goods exports just before Brexit. And so it's interesting to me when a lot of people like to prove that our trade has disappeared after Brexit. And I use monthly data because it's the most recent data that's come out. It's just a pity that had we done this in 2 weeks' time, we would have got the full year for 2023. But in looking at the monthly data, you can see the spike just before we left, and that was people doing what is very sensible for any business. When something is about to happen and you don't know how it's going to affect you, you stockpile. And that is stockpiling in the goods, which you can see there in the middle. But now you can see we export more services than goods, and it's a nice, and this is chain volume measurements, it's a nice increase. And that's great, you know. That's where we're going in the future of our trade. The services that we sell are financial services, and you can see we export a lot more to non-EU countries than we do to EU countries. That's insurance and pensions, again, a lot more to non-EU countries than to EU countries. I mean, a hell of a lot more. And that's other business services. This is our biggest individual sector of exports, is other business services. It's bigger than our plane parts, it's bigger than our car manufacturing. And you can see it mainly goes to non-EU countries. So that's what's happening in services. So basically services are now bigger than goods, and services mainly go to non-EU countries. So let's have a look at goods. That is our goods exports. Again, I've used it in chain volume measurements, and the series didn't come out with the names. And I wonder if you can tell me which one is EU and which one is non-EU. Because the blue line with the big drop, that's the EU line, and the red one was pretty much unaffected. So it's a bit of COVID, a bit of Brexit, a bit of panic, and now nothing much has changed. It's pretty dull. But this is what we trade, and it does amaze me how many people in the UK don't really know what we trade. And I've color-coded this. It comes off the ONS. The dark orange lines are where you get, because the ONS, it's something that people who look at it a lot get used to. They will, in the same spreadsheet, if you're trying to sort it on price, you're going to get a whole sector and individual parts of a sector. And you can see that manufactured goods are 85%. I had to put the percentages in, they don't do that for you, of all of our exports. So when people say we don't make anything anymore, well, basically what we export is manufactured goods. And the biggest particular area of manufactured goods are your first yellow lines. That's air and spacecraft and related machinery, which is part of other transport equipment, and motor vehicles. There are sort of big individual sectors. Now, the air and spacecraft machinery is worth looking at because there it is. Now, these are current prices. They're current prices for a reason. The ONS only gives you that sort of granular by country and by industry in current prices. And you can see that our exports to non-EU countries and our exports to EU countries have both rebounded really well. They were hit by COVID, not by Brexit, because COVID had a travel ban. So all around the world, aircraft was sitting on an airport's runway somewhere. They're all stuck on the tarmac. So most airlines were trying to convince governments to pay their way. And they certainly weren't out there buying new planes or improving their engines. But once that travel ban was over and people got flying again, our aircraft exports have gone back up again to both EU and non-EU countries. The interesting thing about this is though the EU has actually done better than non-EU, the EU is a bit of a dodgy statistic, because this is actually from Rolls-Royce's financial statement. The good news about having one or two companies that really dominate a sector is you can actually just go into their financial statements and get the information. And this is where their sales have gone by the end user. And you can see that I've coloured in yellow the few EU countries, and I have very generously said the rest of Europe is all in the EU. Now, maybe it may not be, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And having done that, the absolute maximum of their sales that are being used by EU people is 18%. So 82% is going to non-EU end users. So, and this is their order book, and they've got 47.7 billion pounds worth of orders, which is up by 6 billion from last year. So that things are looking pretty good in this industry, but this industry is not dependent on being a member of the EU. Quite the opposite. It's not about the EU at all. We only export things to the EU because they're being put into Airbus planes in France. But the end user of the plane gets to choose which engines go in, with the exception of one type of Airbus, which only takes Rolls-Royce engines. So it's, the idea that we need to be in the EU for that industry is not strong. Motor vehicles is quite similar. Again, a massive spike down to do with COVID, and it had a lot to do, this second spike was a shortage of computer chips which are made in China. Once that shortage got out, we found that manufacturing has gone back up. And again, if you think this being current prices has something to do with inflation, you can go into the SMMT, which is just up the road, will tell you that we actually produced over 1 million cars in the UK last year. That's up 17% on the year before. This is our highest year of production we've had for, I think, since 2007. That's a retail worth of 50 billion pounds. And what's interesting about car manufacturing is though we send 60% of the volume of cars we make to the EU, 60% of the value of cars goes to non-EU countries. Basically, non-EU countries buy our expensive cars and the Europeans seem to buy our cheap ones, which is kind of weird, but that's all right. As long as they buy them, we shouldn't care. But I think the most interesting thing is of the 1,025,000 cars we made last year, less than 200,000 went to domestic buyers. Our car industry is basically about exports. And that is why it was very good that the government decided to push back its conversion to electric vehicles in line with some of its export markets. Because it would have been very silly if we had gone to EU EV vehicles when most of what we make is actually going out of the country to other countries, some of whom haven't signed up to the Paris Accord at all and will probably not be going into EV. I've also got into the pharmaceutical industry, but I'm not going to because I've got running out of time. But you can see that it was all doing very well until 2010. Nothing to do with Brexit. 2010, we flattened off, and that is entirely because of the high UK pound against the EU, against the euro. And at that point, a lot of our pharmaceutical companies started to move their production to other locations. Italy was a big winner, and then later Ireland became a big winner. And you see that a lot when people like to blame trade changes on Brexit. There are actually other things involved, and the currency is a really big part of it. I've got a lot about food, which I can just whiz through, because this has been so abused lately. There's a lot of people trying to tell you that we rely on the EU for food. The EU provides 23% of our food by value, which is not by volume, it's by value. And that includes some very expensive EU food because the EU's never been known for producing cheap food. And you will see that by 36% of all the wine we import, and we import 4 billion pounds worth of wine, comes from France by value, but only 16% by volume. We import more wine from Australia than we do from France, which also makes the whole gravity model look ridiculous, because these are figures from 2022 when we had no trade deal with Australia and we had completely free trade with France. So often when the BBC will tell you we rely so much on food from the EU, you should ask them whether they're using value or volume. And you see that the same with, say, something like olive oil. You know, we import a lot of olive oil from the EU, and one of the reasons we do that is that we still add incredibly high tariffs on on non-EU olive oil of over £1,000 per tonne. And we've generously allowed Turkey, which produces very good olive oil, to only pay £930 a tonne if it's in a commercial size canister. And this is an absurd tariff. The UK does not grow olives. We do not produce olive oil. Why are we keeping these tariffs on countries that could supply us with goods for less than we get them from the EU? So one of the reasons we still rely on food from the EU is because we haven't taken tariffs of other countries who are not in the EU. And this includes Australia and New Zealand. You may have heard the head of the NFU tell you how the deals with Australia and New Zealand have ruined British farming. But you may be surprised to learn that we've only lowered the incredibly high tariffs that we put on to, say, UK cheeses from £1,390 a tonne to £920 a tonne for Australia and New Zealand. So we've hardly given them a deal at all. And yet we're worried that they're wiping out British farmers. I mean, if that wipes out British farmers are pretty inefficient. The point of tariffs is it allows a UK farmer to be £920 a tonne less efficient than an Australian farmer or a New Zealand farmer and still keep its market share. And that is hurting UK consumers. It's not protecting UK farmers. UK farmers have to become more efficient if they want to survive. And this is, I'll skip through these, but this is supply and use. Because the other thing is trade isn't everything. And despite what you might hear on the BBC, this is how much we make of our own beef, the blue line. The green line is how much we consume at the top. We're actually supplying most of our own stuff. The traded bit is down here. It's really not very much. And yet, the amount they complain, I mean, you just can't make it up. The British Farmers Association that will continue to tell you that their life has been ruined because of Brexit. Well, Brexit's here. Can you show me how it's been ruined? That's the beef. I mean, it's ridiculous. There is the whole beef, that's BSC in the middle there. And this is pork. Pork supplies have gone up. UK farmers are producing more pork now than they did before Brexit because we're importing less from the EU. I mean, who saw that coming? When has Minette Batters stood up and said, gee whiz, Brexit has been great for UK pork producers, which it has been? No, silence on that. They never bloody mentioned that this has been really good for some people. Now, the future of our trade is probably, hopefully, with India and with the US. But the US is already our biggest trading partner for both exports of goods and exports of services. And that is because we have the same language, the same legal, or similar legal system, similar accounting system, similar businesses. You know, it's hard to see how we could do more trade with the US if we had a trade deal, except we could buy more goods from them. So it might increase our imports, which would be great, and it would take our reliance on the EU off. And with India is the same, that would be great as well. So that's my conclusion. Sorry, I've taken so long, but that's it. Right. But that is it. So basically, you know, did Brexit hurt UK trade? No, it didn't. Is trade determined by price and customer affluence and customer preference? Yes, it is. The affluence is important because you will find in this year's figures, places like Germany who've been in a recession for most of the year will not have bought as many UK goods as they do when they're all feeling rich. I didn't bore you with price inelasticity. I left those slides at home. You're lucky to know. But anyhow, and it's the same. So that's my bit.